Oh hello, how are you my lovely scented friends? Welcome back to another episode of Making Sense Makes Sense, the podcast that's all about demystifying the wonderful world of scent in a way that is fun and accessible without snobbery, gatekeeping or BS. I'm Thomas Dunkley, I'm your host, and I love fragrance. Which isn't surprising really, seeing as this is a perfume podcast. Imagine how weird it would be for me to host a perfume podcast if I didn't like perfume. That would be really weird. So weird, right? Anyway, today's episode is one I've been looking forward to sharing for quite a while because I get to interview one of the OG perfume bloggers. Back when I started writing about perfume all the way back in 2011, I know, I am that old, there were a handful of big blogs that I aspired to be like, and these were blogs like The Scented Salamander, Bois de Jasmine, Now Smell This, and Yesterday's Perfume. Yesterday's Perfume was Barbara Herman's blog, and I always adored her writing, and her focus specifically on vintage fragrances really helped me discover many of the classics, and I think really spurred my interest in perfume. Barbara isn't just a blogger though, she's also written a fascinating book called Scent and Subversion and has created her very own fragrance brand called ERIS Parfums, which takes its name quite beautifully and wonderfully from the goddess of mischief and troublemaking. Now, it will not surprise you that throughout my life, I have been called mischievous and a bit of a troublemaker. I grew up with a cheeky grin. It is the curse that has befallen upon me. So I'm all for mischief and troublemaking, especially olfactory troublemaking. And this seems entirely fitting as a name because Barbara is somewhat of a disruptor and shaker-upper of the world of perfume with her line of vintage-inspired scents presented in a modern context. They're gorgeous, sometimes challenging, even political, but always fascinating. So it's very exciting that I'm interviewing Barbara today, and it feels like it's been a long time coming. It's a bit of a full circle moment for me, having, started reading about perfume many years ago, and Barbara's blog being really, really important to me. So let's just get straight into this interview because it's really, really fascinating. But before we do, as always, here's a very quick word from our sponsors. This episode of Making Sense Makes Sense is sponsored by Carium. I read somewhere that there were over 8,000 fragrance launches in 2024, with even more expected in 2025. Never before has there been so much perfume, which is a great thing. We love perfume, let's be honest. But this means it can be really hard to hear through all that olfactory noise. And now, with so much choice, it can be hard to find a new signature scent. Carium believe that scent is complex and deeply personal, with overwhelming choice often making the search intimidating and descriptions often impossible. Carium seeks to solve this and works as the scent sommelier to help decode and deepen customers' connections to fragrance. This is a unique experience where the scent sommelier helps people discover fragrances intuitively, guided by their own words, emotions, and memories, and removing distractions such as branding, packaging, or preconceptions, focusing purely on the scent and the customer's personal response. You don't just choose a fragrance, the words you use, your personal associations all drive the experience thanks to an AI model that has learned from thousands of real descriptions to understand the language of scent. From niche fragrance boutiques to partnerships with the world's most renowned brands, Carium continues to demonstrate its ability to reach diverse audiences by supporting and enhancing customers' fragrance selection experiences. The data shows a 139% increase of store visitors after introduction of Carium in the scent selection process, and also reveals a 287% increased conversion rate in store. In London, you can now experience it in iconic settings, in boutique perfumeries, and in Selfridges, making this sophisticated sensory intelligent fragrance discovery accessible. So why not pop into Selfridges or Parfum La Danse in London to see how Carium's innovative AI solution can help you cut through all that olfactory noise and discover your next signature scent. Barbara, I'm so excited to be speaking with you. I feel like we've encountered each other in the online space many times over the years, but we've never had the opportunity to have a proper conversation. So I'm thrilled to have you here on Making Sense Make Sense.
Thank you for having me. And I do feel like I know you. So it feels like a continuation of a conversation in a way.
Absolutely. Now, I know you were born in Vietnam, is that right? But grew up in
Yes.
America.
Yeah.
How do you feel that kind of that upbringing in those two places shaped your relationship with scent in any way?
Well, I mean, I grew up in Arkansas and Texas, and Vietnam was, filled. I was raised in or born in Saigon and lived there until I was 3. So I remember going to the markets. I remember the pungency of not just the flavors, but the smells of the market with, flowers and tropical fruit and meat and fish and all of those scents mingling together. So, the sort of flavor profiles that I grew up like as a baby and a infant tasting and smelling, I think it's informed that I like really vivid, bold, sometimes difficult flavors and scents. Like, I'm very comfortable with that. I like having, something really, grab me.
Yeah, something challenging and interesting and unique.
Yes.
Grab you. Okay. And would you say that you were quite scent obsessed growing up, or not just fragrance wise, but just smell obsessed? Was that something that you were consciously thinking about, or?
Not conscious of, but, when I was writing Sentence Aversion, I recalled, um, I think I started getting really into scent, as a tween
Hmm.
and definitely as a teenager. So, I grew up in 80s Texas, and one of my earliest sort of real olfactory, not just olfactory, but perfume memories was I had this piano teacher who, was a hardcore menthol cigarette smoker. And
Hmm.
so even if she didn't smoke around me during our piano lessons, I would smell that menthol cigarette, miasma stuck to her. But she also wore fracas.
Of course.
So it's almost like I had, tuberose criminelle in my mind before
Hmm.
that scent existed. But that mingling of two very different things, I just connected it to her and I liked her a lot and I thought she was really eccentric. So just this sort of piano music, this kind of synesthetic, memory is very intense.
And that's one of those fragrances bold enough to be sort of paired with the scent of cigarette smoke, I
Exactly.
imagine. Yeah.
They didn't clash. They just somehow created this very interesting memory for me.
And you started out blogging on your blog, which was Yesterday's Perfume, and you focused predominantly on vintage fragrances.
Yes.
I'm curious, where did that obsession with vintage perfume start?
I think what happened was I started reading, the blogs and the books that were out around that time and was like, oh, wow, people are writing about perfume. Who knew that you could do that?
Hmm.
And it sort of revived my interest in scent. And, I was really interested in the fragrances that people were describing that weren't easily accessible. And I think I liked that challenge. So I started actually initially just collecting, some contemporary fragrances, but really getting into collecting vintage. And when my collection got, big enough and was intriguing enough, that's when I decided, okay, I want to write about vintage perfume. And part of the reason I wanted to write about vintage in particular was also that it was the circumscribed area because, this is around 2008. And I mean, I don't even know if I would be able to write about perfume now because there's so much of it.
Hmm.
I was already overwhelmed in 2008.
Yeah.
So I think I was kind of like, I want to investigate perfume. I want to write about it, but what's a kind of neat and tidy way of keeping it contained so I don't feel too overwhelmed? And that's kind of why I approached the past, but also because I was really intrigued by animalic fragrances and all these categories that weren't really popular at the time. So it was just like, yeah, in a circumscribed investigative area.
Yeah. With a bit of treasure hunting thrown in for fun.
Exactly. Hmm.
And would you say that kind of that love of animalics and also the boldness is what separated the vintage for you at the time and the fragrances. I was going to say fragrances now, but I suppose fragrances in 2008, as you've already kind of said, is such a different landscape as to now,
Very.
isn't it? So at that time, was it that boldness and that animalic quality that you felt really stood out as being different from
I
modern
think so.
fragrances?
I think so. It was when, I when I collected my first few animalic fragrances, and I was like, oh wow, these are so intense and so interesting and so evocative, and I had a real emotional reaction to them, and they fired my imagination. There was this sort of constellation of two or three vintage fragrances that once I started sitting with them that I was like, okay, I have to write about this. So it wasn't
Mm.
just animalic, but definitely animalic was what pulled me in. The boldness and the uniqueness at that time for me of animalic fragrances. I mean, there was Coeur de Russie and things like that, but I would not have known to seek that out if it hadn't been for the vintage fragrances that were animalic.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously that led you to writing your book, Scent and Subversion. And when I think about your writing, whether it was in the book or in the blog, it's never just been about the odor profile of a fragrance. Obviously, you've been very descriptive and you talk about the fragrances, how they smell, but I feel like it's always been about the culture around them as well as their impact on culture and how they fit in with the zeitgeist of the time. So I
Yeah.
suppose my question is whether you think people truly realize or appreciate the cultural impact of fragrance.
Well, I mean, I think unless you're looking at vintage fragrances and vintage fragrance ads and, the radio spots and the TV ads, unless you're kind of doing that comparison, it's like anything else. You don't really know what the culture is when you're in it necessarily, unless you are a historian by nature or an analytical person by nature, you know, or yeah, unless that's sort of your bent, it's hard to think about what the culture is. Like even now, I've been thinking, because my book is out of print, and I'm thinking, I would love to have it published again, but I would want to have some updated essays. And I've wondered, like, what would I even say about this moment outside of the fact that all the sort of categories that seemed rare at the time that I was writing Sentence Aversion are now people are doing them, and there lots of people are doing them. But I think the one thing I would focus on is the excess in number. Um, and the sort of the thing that I really loved about perfume and what it was pulling me towards at the time that I was writing about it was I was starting to like professionally, I was a writer for a blog. So I was online all the time. And I think there was a reason why I was drawn to perfume at that moment, cultural moment, because I was trying to get back to my senses um, at a time when the internet was really pulling me away professionally, and just it was part of the way we were all living, still are living. And so I think if I were to write essays on what's going on now, I would say that, because of Instagram, because of TikTok, the visual is coming back into perfume in a way that I'm not entirely comfortable with. Like personalities, like all these things that I feel like perfume helped draw me into mystery and into the non-visual and into sort of, I don't know, linguistic, even though I was writing about it. It was taking me to this mysterious place. And I feel like the internet and Instagram, TikTok, and all of the influencers are all kind of bringing us back to the visual. And obviously, I have a critique of that, but who knows? That could mean something different later. So I think that would be one area that of investigation if somebody were to write about perfume later, or even now if they, you know, could analyze what's going on at the moment, which is always hard.
Because it just moves at so much of a
Yes.
faster pace now, even than it did sort of say 10 years ago. And I
Yeah,
suppose the time frame you were looking at with the fragrances of the last century, you're looking at fragrance houses that would put years and years of investment into a fragrance, and they're
exactly.
not launching even one a year. It might be one every 5 years,
Exactly. Which is
whereas now
kind of
they're
hard to imagine now.
I know, because it's now five every year, and
Yeah.
and I suppose the difference is it's not coming from a place of, well, this has to work, we have to make it work because it's our only new fragrance for 5 years. It's, well, actually now it's, well, we're launching five this year, so we'll just see which sticks and which the
Yeah.
market responds to. So it's a very completely different landscape, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the good news is that so many more people are into perfume, which that makes me
Absolutely.
happy, because that was one of the things that, it was still really truly a subculture, as you know, of people who are collecting perfume, writing about it, talking about it with each other. And I'm happy that that is a sense that people are really getting into, because it is a true pleasure to have that in your life. Um, I think I just worry about like how, I don't know, overwhelming the whole scene is right now.
Yeah, it feels like it's just exploding and not stopping, doesn't it,
Yeah.
sometimes? And I wonder, in the next century, what people will look back at as being the classics of our time. Do you think
Hmm.
you have a sense of that, or
My
are you not paying
gosh.
too much attention to what's out there?
Our time meaning like, I don't
Well,
know.
of this century, I suppose, of this century, if we look.
Gosh. I mean, I'm sure there's a few. I don't get me to talk about them now, because I would have to really think about that, but I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it'd be fascinating to see who the Barbara Herman of the 2100s will be looking back, I think. And because I think fragrance is one of those timeless things that there will be people interested in
Oh,
the
yeah.
previous eras going forward. I think it's going to just be, they're going to have a lot more to muddle through, I suppose.
Yes, they will. But
um
it's really intriguing. Yeah, it's very curious I'll be very curious. I don't think it can continue to get so big. I mean,
hmm.
a bubble is going to burst at some point. Um, but yeah, it's a very fascinating time for scent for sure.
Absolutely. And you started your brand Eris in 2016, I believe.
Mhm.
And you named the brand, and I love this about it. It's named after the Greek goddess of troublemaking and disruption. Did you
Yes.
set out to disrupt the industry? Was that your intention?
No.
Okay.
I set out for sure to sort of offer the things that at the time I felt weren't available, and to just also, like, I really felt like I had something to say in perfume. And particularly once I secured Antoine Lie as the perfumer, who would be able to make what it is I wanted to say in perfume actually happen. Um, you know, it just everything kind of fell into place. I'm very instinctual and operate a lot on vibes. So even though I didn't have money, I didn't even like have a place. I wasn't in a settled city at the time, didn't have a job, but I knew sort of in my bones that I what I wanted the brand to be, the kind of fragrances I wanted to have, and just the vibe. Like, once I learned about Eris and I learned about her in New Orleans, actually, I'm sure people have heard the story, but there's a Mardi Gras crew, the parade that at the time marched without permits, without permission. And I was like, that's such a cool name. And there was always like people who handmade their costumes. There were a bunch of anarchists at the time. I think it's like evolved since then, but it was a crew of anarchists in New Orleans, and that was the name of their crew. And I just thought the name was beautiful, and then I looked it up and I was like, wait, she's the Greek goddess of discord and chaos and troublemaking and all that. I was like, okay, that is the perfect name for this brand. Um, because I do like things that are unconventional and like sometimes slightly unsettling. And so yeah, that's what I wanted to put out there.
I absolutely love that. I think operating on vibes is a pretty good candidate for the name of this episode. I think I love that. That's a good mantra. So you didn't have a lot of things in place that normal people would normally have when they're thinking, I'm going to start a fragrance brand. But what you did have was a really clear vision of what you wanted
Yeah.
to do, and and
Yeah.
and you've done that with Antoine Lie, who listeners will know is a perfumer who's worked with brands like Comme des Garçons, Etat Libre d'Orange, Tom Ford. How did that relationship come about? How did you meet Antoine, and how did you get him to be your perfumer?
So before I answer that question, I was at Pitti Fragranza this year, and I was speaking to Luca Maffei, whose
Mm.
lab Antoine works with in Milan. And it's so funny. He was so succinct about something that had never occurred to me, but I told him, I'm going to quote you over and over again. He said, Antoine Lie is the original pioneer of niche perfumery in a way because of his work for État Libre d'Orange and Comme des Garçons. And I said, he really kind of is the pioneer perfumer in that space. So yeah, and I encountered him through Sensation Magnifique and all of the fragrances that he did for État Libre d'Orange, as well as like Blood Concept, MA, and just all of these weird but incredibly beautiful fragrances that really lodged in my limbic system, you know? Fragrances, he created fragrances that I was thinking about after I smelled them. Um, so I reached out to him because I wanted to interview him for the Scent Visionary section of Scent and Subversion, and I said, I would love to talk to you about, like, once you got this perfume brief for Sécrétion Magnifique, how did you translate that into perfume language and notes and all that. So we had a conversation around that, and that's how I met him, but it was on the phone. Um, and I really liked him. I thought he was a very down to earth, amazing perfumer, which is, I like to joke that you don't often run into master French perfumers who are also down to earth. Um, so we just kept in touch, and when, I wanted to create this brand, I asked him if he would be interested, and he said yes. And he worked at the time, he worked at a perfume house that allowed him to work with nobodies essentially. So, somebody who didn't even have a brand yet. Um, so that's how that happened.
Which which is quite rare. I think a lot of people don't realize that if you want to work with one of the big name perfumers working at someone like IFF or Firmenich or Givaudan, obviously they want you to make a big order, don't they,
Yeah.
for the oil? And if you're a small brand, that's not always possible.
They want you to make a big order, or they want you to be somebody, you know? Like,
Mm,
I think
mm,
you could be somebody who didn't make a big order, but if you're famous or,
yeah.
something like that. And I was none of those things. So it was great that he wanted to flex some creativity muscles. So
Yeah.
he said yes.
I can see why you were drawn to him as a perfumer, because when you think of some of the fragrances he's created, they are, bold, sometimes terrifying. If we think of
Yeah.
Secretion Magnifique, and just really pushing the boundaries of what olfaction and art can be. And
Yeah. Without ever being gratuitous.
mm,
I think
mm,
there can be a lot of that gratuitousness in shock value in
yes,
perfume, and I think the thing with Antoine is that he really truly loves perfume. He's, obviously trained, to understand classical perfumery, and so when he's pushing the boundaries, he's doing it with intent and with,
mm,
I think, a lot of taste often, even though he's going pretty far, as we all know, but it's never gratuitous.
absolutely not. It's done with intention or humor, or with just some, I suppose, intelligence. I suppose is probably the right way to describe
Yeah,
it. It's
integrity too, I think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what I find really interesting about that kind of partnership between someone like you, who's more like a creative director in this role, is that creative partnership is how you forge your own creative dialogue with the perfumer. What would you say that dialogue between you and Antoine is like?
It is multisensory.
Mm,
I've mentioned this in other interviews, but usually I would say 70-80% of the time, the name of the perfume comes first. And then what accrues around that is the scent profile that I think would fit that, imagery, whether it's from fashion, from movies, sometimes just a color, sometimes just a texture. And all of that will then turn into a perfume brief, whether it's still inchoate or really involved. It really depends. It can develop. But by the time I'm approaching him with an idea, he will have the name, the perfume brief, the mood board, fragrances that I like that are out now in that kind of general category, fragrances in the past, and just like I'll just throw everything at him that I have. I'll also be like, and I want it to make somebody feel like this.
So the emotion comes into it quite
Oh,
intently.
for sure. And it's very, I mean, I make it as clear as I can possibly make it what direction I want it to go into. And he really, he's less of a verbal person than he is a visual person. And so he really appreciates the mood boards. Like he'll read what I send to him, but I think it's the mood boards and the other information that is most helpful for him.
That's interesting. So what type of things are you putting on those mood boards? Is it colors, textures?
Yeah, like so let's say Scorpio rising. That one definitely actually the name and the scent profile kind of arrived together. I'd always wanted to do a sort of Scorpio-esque fragrance. Always wanted to do a really clovey, peppery fragrance. And so those two things kind of arrived together. And in the mood board, and of course I wanted him to make it as clovey and spicy as possible. So I was thinking of the color red, so there's a lot of red there. There was this beautiful show that McQueen did. I think it was the Joan of Arc show, and I remembered the scene when I think it was either Stella Tennant, I can't remember which, or Erin O'Connor, I can't remember which model it was, but she's standing in a ring of fire. And first she stands there and she's in all red and she might even be masked. I'm not sure, but there's this fire that develops around her and she kind of, it almost looks satanic.
Hmm.
And I was joking with somebody recently that Eris is not evil, but it's like evil adjacent. It has, speaking of vibes, it has a kind of darkness about it that I like to tap into. Um, Visually anyway, or vibe wise. And so anyway, so she's there in that ring of fire. There's the Caron ad for Poivre, which has like a dragon circling around the bottle, things like that. And then there's, like black nails. And so it was very gothy, obviously. And then there's the Kenneth Anger film, Scorpio Rising. So there's the black leather jacket with Scorpio Rising studded onto it. Um, so it has that kind of like biker leather S&M BDSM vibe too. So it's got, Satan, BDSM, vintage perfume.
Alexander McQueen. It's got everything.
It kind of does have everything.
But that must for him to be a kind of perfumer's dream because that's so rich. It's such a rich palette to work from. Whereas you're not talking materials there with him at all. Really, you're saying these are the
I said it has
mm,
to have
oh, the
cloves. So
clove.
there's
Yeah.
like little images of
Mm.
like, pepper and cloves, but definitely the smoke and all of the other stuff, if he's thinking of pepper and clove and then he sees all this other stuff, he can go in that direction. Leather and,
So I
yeah.
think that's a good example to stay with. So with say for Scorpio Rising, you give that really rich, multifaceted mood board, and then you get your first round of mods from him. How does that conversation then take place? What's the dialogue now? What are the next steps? How do you both together refine the vision?
So in that case, because it was just so like, I know exactly what I want, and here's the imagery, here are some of the ingredients, here's the fragrances that I'm inspired by or whatever. So what he'll do is he'll send the first mods. So in that case, it wasn't like with Delta of Venus where I said, I want a fragrance centered around guava. So with that, what started, it still had the same thing. Here's the name, here's the mood board, here's the fragrances. With that one, he sent me guava accords first to smell so that he knew what to work around. So we worked on that first, but with Scorpio Rising, I think he just got to work on the fragrance that he thought fit all of the things that I said. So he would send mods and that's kind of how it always works. Like the first 3 or 4, he's kind of shifting it in different directions, and I tell him which direction we should keep going in, which one I absolutely hate or whatever, and then we just keep doing it until we both kind of feel like it's finished.
And that is often a vibe, isn't it? When you get there and you're like, oh, we know this is it, and
Yes.
it's, are you often in sync with that, do you think, when you get to the point where you're both like, this is the one?
I think the one that has been the most, complex for me, and it's the one that's coming up in the spring, and I don't know if that's because he delivered the brief so well that even I was shocked by it and surprised by it, that it's gonna be so interesting. I wish I could tell you more, but I can't. Um, Usually we're on the we know when it's ready. I think with this one, it's been a really complicated thing, but we finally arrived at the same place, but it took me a while. So I find that intriguing, and I'm curious how that's going to translate into how other people feel about it. And I think the thing is too is that the longer he and I work together too, I mean, we're both changing as well. So, um, and the way we communicate changes. So maybe I'm being more difficult with him than I had been in the past, or this perfume brief was just so complicated and fraught in some ways that carried over, but it's a, evolving um sort of method and way that we work together. So it's like any relationship, right? It changes. So it's very interesting to see it over almost 10 years.
But also, you're developing a skill as well, aren't you? Because fragrance development in itself is a set of skills. You're trying
Yeah,
to create something out of
yeah,
nothing, and as you do it, the more times you do it, I suppose you become more attuned to it. So maybe it is that you've developed your skills in such a way now that it's actually very different from when you did the first three.
yeah. It's such an interesting thing to do because yeah, I didn't go to school for, perfume development or even knowing how to communicate that. Like it's one thing to write about it, but to actually have a brand and be like, this is how it's you learn as you go. Everything I've done with Eris has been learn as I go.
And you started with the three fragrances, didn't you? Which was Belle de Jour,
Mhm.
Night Flower, and was it Mabette? Was the
Yes.
first one?
Yeah.
How long did you work on those three?
We worked on those for like a year. I would say that that was sort of, for me, the easiest because I didn't know what I was doing. So I kind of was just like giving him the briefs, smelling, what he had. And he shared 3 with me. And I think if I had known what I was doing, I would have picked 1 and then focused on, like, shifting and changing that one, but I was sort of like, "Oh my god, Antoine Lie gave me all these, I love them all." And so we kind of developed 3 as a trio. Um, I gave some feedback, but those are really, have the least intervention from me, I would say. A, because there were 3 right away, and B, because I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Um, but, I it did he did create what I wanted him to create, which was each fragrance was sort of like a contrast between the animalic and the floral, masculine, feminine, comfort and unease, and he did it in such interesting ways for each one. Like, one is kind of more attached to the vintage inspiration, Mabette, and Belle de Jour and Night Flower. Oh, and Belle de Jour in particular, I think, is the one where he's, like, interpreting animalic as, like, kinda salty skin, sweaty skin. It's very fascinating, but, yeah, that was the first collection, Beauty and the Beast.
And yeah, absolutely, very, very human almost in the way that it was animalic, I think.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
and so with those first three, it was, you were sort of in a way creating vintage perfumes in a modern context,
Yes.
with
Those
modern
were the
taste, modern
3
materials.
definitely fit that
Yeah,
description. Yeah.
yeah. But it's evolved a lot since then. So now, would you say the vision for the brand that you had right at the very beginning has that shifted in a way now that you're almost 10 years on, or the key principles still the same, maybe, but
I don't think so, because the sort of, celebrating unconventional beauty and subversive glamour has kind of been there from the beginning, and that continues to inform all of the choices. Like, I like to say that there are pretty faces, and then there are interesting faces. And so Eris is the interesting face of perfume. And I feel like those are the faces you remember. Those are the faces that stay with you. And those are the faces that you actually fall in love with. I don't think too many people fall in love with perfection. So I'm not interested in that.
no, I totally agree. I think perfection is dull. I think character is what keeps things in your memory, isn't it? And I
Yeah.
always think about the actress Rossi De Palma. One of the
Hmm.
most distinct looking women I think on the planet, but so strikingly beautiful.
Yes,
You would never forget her face because
exactly.
there's no one else who looks like her. And
Exactly.
it's those the fragrances are like that in a way, aren't they? They are just unique
Yeah.
and unusual.
And I think, it's sort of like there's a concept of the joke, that the reason jokes work is that there's always sort of one part of the joke that your brain has to work out in order to get to the punchline, because it's kind of a logical sort of something is inconsistent. And I feel like our brains like to have to work a little bit. And I feel like it's the same with the nose brain. Like, even though people might smell two fragrances, one kind of like perfect or doesn't disturb you at all, and then the one that might have something a little bit strange about it, you might initially consciously say you like the perfect one, but I think it's the second one that stays with you. And I see that with myself, with people, with dishes that have things that I have to acquire a taste for. The things that I have to work a little bit more for are the ones that I remember and I crave again. And I think, if there's any kind of teaching element in perfumery, that's what I want people to understand, is that you really shouldn't just go by your first impression of something. And you see that in reviews, like, people will be like, "I hated it, and then I couldn't get enough." Or they'll revise their initial review. Um, it's like people, you can't I mean, I guess you can fall in love with someone right away, but I find that it's the sort of push and pull that makes it a more interesting getting to know someone or something.
Yeah, the tension I think is what makes it, and I think that's what, if we look back through the history of fragrance and we think about the classics that even just looking back in the 90s, fragrances that were classic were things like Angel, things like CK1, and that's because these were fragrances that at the time they came out they didn't exist. They weren't a riff on another existing thing. They were entirely new, and when people smelled them, they would either be like, "Well, that I don't understand it," and it's like
Mhm.
that's part of the barrier, isn't it? I remember with Angel, the first time I smelled it, I was like, "This is disgusting. What's wrong with
Oh,
it?"
really?
It's my favorite fragrance. I wear it all the time.
Yeah.
I'm probably my
That
longest
was a
relationship.
that was a love at first smell for me, because I
Hmm.
smelled it on someone who it worked on so well.
Yeah.
And it was like, "I've never smelled this before. What is that?" I didn't even know what to make of it.
Yeah.
But for me, it was my mother has fantastic taste in perfume, and I gave her a bottle of Angel, and she was like, "This is incredible." So I was like, "Okay, this is a good fragrance," because she was the person who was wearing Femme and,
Oh
Magie
wow.
Noir, and she knew her good fragrances, so I knew when she liked Angel that it was good.
Yeah,
I mean, I knew it
absolutely.
too, but she was the one who clinched it for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a place for things that smell nice and pretty, I think, and just easy. I think we
Yeah,
all have those days, but I think to make an impact, something has to be divisive, unusual, new. I think that's what makes a great fragrance rather than just a good one.
I think so.
One of the things I was really I was thinking about the other day when I was thinking about talking to you is that you have your fragrance it's stylized as MX, I think pronounced Mux. Is that right?
Mix or
The
mux, yeah. I say mix,
mix, yeah.
yeah.
Mixed. Okay. And that was created as a gender fluid fragrance using those pronouns. And I know this came out a few years ago now, actually, but there's so much dialogue now, much of it negative about gender expression and sexuality. It feels like we're sort of taking kind of a pendulum swing backwards. And I feel like Mix makes a bold and much needed statement. Do you think perfume can be political and can it be a protest?
I mean, I that was really one of the most interesting things about perfume for me when I got into it. I mean, obviously there's the aesthetic beauty and all of the intrigue around, what I was smelling and that pleasure, but I was very, very interested in the fact that there were fragrances that we consider masculine now that were made for women in the 20s and 30s. And so sort of the very first thing that struck me was that, in the same way that I always knew but was really learning that gender is constructed. So, it's constructed in perfumery too, and we have proof that woody fragrances or leather fragrances or bitter fragrances are not essentially masculine because they were made for women in the past. And, learning that, certain floral fragrances were like made for men and men loved that. Like all of it is so arbitrary. And it is, and that really intrigued me about perfume. So I think anytime gender comes into the picture, it is going to be political because, um, it's about power. It's about like putting people in their place. It's about reducing people in a way. And I think perfume, like so many other things, shows you that you cannot reduce any of that. Try, but, perfume the reason I was interested in perfume and subversion is that I experienced it in high school. I went to a private high school for a couple years. We had to wear uniforms. We could not in any way embellish those uniforms with, like, colored socks or, I'd wear a jacket and my jacket would get confiscated. So I just started wearing men's cologne. I mean, it wasn't, I think, conscious that I just loved Jeffrey Bean's, gray flannel, so I wore it, but then I realized later, that I really appreciated that they couldn't tell me not to wear men's cologne, so I was embellishing my uniform, but it was invisible, and it was evading the rules in a strange way, and, I think a lot of people have done that with perfume over the years. So yeah, long answer. I think perfume, like everything else, is political if you want it to be.
Yeah, and I think it's a fairly, I think it's an easy protest that I think people can
Yeah,
opt for because
exactly.
it is invisible, like you say. I know people can smell it and detect it, but a lot of people aren't, I suppose, attuned enough to know that you're wearing something that you
Yeah.
shouldn't be, in
And
quotation
I
marks.
think people, it's like everything in a way that's part of culture is making an argument about something.
Hmm.
And if you are a man wearing a woman's perfume, if you're a woman wearing a man's perfume, you're making the argument that it doesn't matter what the
Yeah,
gender is and that there is gender fluidity. I mean, you don't have to believe in gender fluidity. It exists,
yeah, it's
you
right
know?
there.
That's
Yeah,
just the way it is. So,
yeah,
the conversation was really happening around 2016, 2017. I was writing about it because I was a journalist at the time. And so I thought that's a great name for a perfume because one of my favorite perfumes from the 70s was Charlie. And I loved not only the perfume, but the ad and how it connected with something that was happening in culture. Um, and it, left an impression on me and everybody else who saw that TV ads and ads. And so I thought it would be lovely to sort of do a version of that, but for, the gender sort of revolution.
and I think it's a bold statement to make, and I think it was then in 2016, and it is still now. And I find it really interesting what you said about the fragrances, the gender in fragrances shifted so much because what was feminine previously is now masculine and vice versa. I always think about when I see the fragrances that men want now, which is they want to do this whole smell maxing, they want to be, really, really loud with their fragrance, they want heavy hitting things.
Yeah.
I think, well, look at all the feminines of the 80s.
Yeah.
Coco by Chanel is
Exactly.
the perfect modern masculine when you think about it. It's
Yes.
just,
Or
it's,
opium.
yeah. And I think it's just, it's so, well, fragrance is so ephemeral because the styles change so quickly, I suppose. And I think it's just, you have to go at it with, there are no rules. I think that's the only approach you can
But
have.
I would add to that that even though, yes, there's the subset of, the whole, smell maxing, like, it has to last a long time, it needs to
Yeah.
project, and it needs to be big. I mean, come on, we know what's really what the subtext of that is. Even though there's some of those folks, the thing that heartens me is that, there are a lot more men who are wanting to and actually not even thinking about wearing a fragrance that is floral. And they're not, like, making a big stink about it, they're just, like, wearing what they like, and I think that if there's any big shift that I would write about in this, like, additional essay of my book that I would love to have published again, is that that kind of taboo has, I think, largely, or maybe it's just for the second subculture, it's largely gone away. Like, I was writing about it as if it was some big deal. I don't think it's a big deal for a lot of people now. So that is a wonderful development.
Yeah. And I think niche has done that a lot because the
Yes.
niche fragrances have all largely been not marketed as any particular gender. So,
Yeah.
you go to Tom Ford's
Exactly.
counter, men aren't, there's no differentiation between the florals in the line and
Yeah.
the ouds,
Yeah,
only the
people who are
names maybe.
really into perfume, they wanna smell it all, and they might
Yeah.
even wanna wear it all, and
Yeah.
that is a big development. Because I remember even when ERIS launched, somebody asked me, "So night flower is only for women?" And I was like, "Why would it be only for women?" And they're like, "'Cause the word flower is in it." And I'm like, "Nah, I don't think that's gonna stop men from wearing it," and it hasn't.
No, absolutely. We're in a different market now, and I always think back to Jean Paul Gaultier had that fantastic fragrance Fleur de Mal, which
Mhm.
completely tanked, and I can't remember when it was launched, but it was good over 10 years ago. I think if you launch that now, it would be in a different market. People would
Yeah,
be the word fleur in a men's fragrance wouldn't be the killer that it was
yeah,
back
and I think
then.
I think we have to, like, I'm really good at critiquing things, but I think we have to celebrate that because that is a
Yeah,
big shift. Even
yeah,
though there's, like, these little conservative like, um, backlashes to that with this kinda smell maxing stuff, which, I mean, I'm sorry, but, just don't get me started on that. Um,
that's another podcast episode.
I think we can celebrate that there's been a lot more sort of progressive thinking around
Yeah,
gender and perfume
yeah.
since even the launch of Eris.
Yeah, and that definitely is to be celebrated. And I think a lot of my listeners now who've had this conversation would probably be chomping at the bit to kind of explore Eris. Where would you recommend them? What would you recommend as a starting point, I suppose, for someone who wanted to explore Eris and get a feel for the vibe of the brand, but also, we talk about fragrances that are maybe unique, distinct, challenging. Where would you point them towards?
I years and years ago when I was writing Scent and Subversion, I worked at a perfume shop for the first time in my life, and it was a very interesting job to have because I saw how people behave when they, are dealing with fragrance. And one of the things I would always ask them is if they are experimental or if there are things they don't like or do like. And I think that's usually a good place to start. So, like, if you like challenging fragrances and that's where you wanna start, I would say probably, go to the Beauty and the Beast collection because you'll start with Belle de Jour, move to Night Flower, and then Ma Bête, which is definitely the most polarizing of all of the fragrances in the line. But really, it's kind of like choose your own adventure. Like, maybe go for the category that you like. It really depends on your personality. If you wanna play it safe, go with the fragrance category that you tend to like and try that and then move onward, but I'm not really very prescriptive about that stuff. I just say plunge into it. But if they do start with ma bête and they don't like challenging fragrances, I would be sad if they thought all the fragrances were that difficult, because they're not. But,
Yeah. Yeah. Just dive in. That's the
yeah.
advice. Dive in, explore. And also, you've got some really beautiful, evocative descriptions on your website. So actually, you can just read through all of those and see which one speaks to you, I think,
Yeah.
because they're all very distinct personalities and characters, I would say.
Yeah. But I'm all about just diving in and mucking about, because that's how I got into scent. I grew up in the 80s in Dallas, Texas, when big fragrances were in, and I would just go to every single perfume counter, men, women, whatever it was, and I would spray everything. I think that's kind of the way to do it.
Just spray everything. I love that. And what's next for ERIS? I know you've hinted that there's a new one coming in the spring, but I'm assuming you've got lots of lofty plans for the future.
I do. I mean, I would love to, have ERIS everywhere, have like sort of, you know, ancillary products, and I would like to be able to focus more on the creative direction and like traveling and talking about the fragrance. So I'm kind of in the midst right now of working on a pitch deck and trying to pitch investment, because Eris can't grow if it's just me. And at the moment, it really, and has been for a very long time, just me. So that's kind of where I'm at right now, is hoping that Eris can go big next year. And not just to go big, but so that I can actually really realize the 5 new fragrances that I have a Google Doc on, or, reach more audiences and that sort of thing.
Give you more space for more vibes.
Yes, more vibes.
Fantastic. Well, I, for one, will be watching to see what happens, because I really love what you do and I love your brand. I think it's really got a unique voice that's much needed in the industry. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. It's been such a pleasure. I love talking about fragrance with you. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Finally getting to speak with Barbara after all these years of being a complete and utter fanboy was a real treat. I love her approach to perfume, and I think that the perfume bros could really learn a lot by seeking out and sniffing her scents. But let's be real, it's not just about the perfume bros. We spend too much of our beautiful, precious time talking about the perfume bros. Let's forget them for a moment, because I think all of you could learn and enjoy a lot by going out and sniffing ERIS Parfums if you haven't already. My highlights are Green Spell, which is a sharp, classic green fragrance with delightfully jagged talons, and Ma Bête, which is best described as one of the filthiest fragrances I've ever had the utter pleasure of sniffing. It's incredibly beastly and furry. It's an experience you should definitely try. Now, you can find out more about ERIS Parfums on their website, erisparfums.com. You can also follow them on Instagram at ERIS Parfums, and I will put those in the show notes for you for ease. That's it for this week, and I will be back next week with another exciting new episode, which I am very sorry to inform you will be the last in this season. I know, very sad news indeed, but we are going out with a bang. It's a fantastic interview with a very well-known perfumer who has worked commercially at one of the biggest fragrance houses that you can ever work at, creating some of the most famous fragrances. I'm sure you will have some of their fragrances in your collections, and then has also gone and created their own brand. It's a very unique, interesting, and I will say candid interview, so do make sure you tune in for that. And also, because it is the end of the year and also the last episode of the season, I thought I would share with you a highlight of some of my favorite fragrances of the year, some of my favorite fragrance launches of 2025. And I would really love to share some of yours as well. So if you would like to tell me what your favorite fragrance launch of 2025 was and why, then I suppose there are two ways you can do that. You can DM me on Instagram at Making Sense Make Sense, or you can drop me an email at thomas@thomasdunkley.com, and I may share a few of those. in the episode. One final note about that episode, because it is the Christmas festive week next week, I'll be sharing the episode slightly earlier than normal. So we won't be going out on Wednesday, we'll be going out on Monday. So that'll be Monday the 22nd. And then you can all just relax and enjoy your Christmas. And yes, that will be it for season 2, can you believe, of Making Sense Make Sense. A massive thank you to Carium, our sponsor for this episode. I'm all about making fragrance and fragrance discovery more accessible, and if you don't know that about me, then you clearly have not been listening. And Carium's innovative AI solution, the Scent Sommelier, offers an entirely new way to explore fragrance by translating scent into language. You can find out more at www.carium.com. As usual, I will hand over to our guest to tell us the fragrance they have an emotional connection with. After all, fragrance is an emotional art form. If you want to follow me on Instagram, you can at Making Sense Make Sense. But for now, it's over to the wonderful, nay, the iconic, no, legendary, I don't know, the sublime Barbara Herman, who'll tell you all about her emotional connection fragrances. I will see you next week.
Well, the one that I like to talk about, because people often ask, like, how did you get into vintage and why did you, like, it's kind of a crazy thing to just suddenly, like, quit your job and start writing about vintage perfume, which I did. But I would say that there were so many that I connected with, but for some reason, I specifically remember Chanel #19 being the one that I was both emotionally connected to and imaginatively connected to. And that's the fragrance that I lost an entire Saturday night thinking about and writing about. And it was the fragrance that said to me that you can spend a whole night being entertained by perfume, at least one night. Because I didn't make any plans. I just sat there and time seemed to stand still, and I was just writing about this fragrance and getting lost in it and thinking about it and, imagining scenes that the fragrance was conjuring for me. So I would say that's the one that feels like it really, gripped me both emotionally and imaginatively. In terms of just pure emotionally, I would say it was a Robert Piguet fragrance, Baghari. That was the first animalic fragrance that I remember just hitting me in the gut. I was like, "What is this?" It was pure, like, physical, emotional reaction, whereas there was a lot of intellect around Chanel #19, which I guess makes sense because one's animalic and another one's kind of, like, green and fresh and all that, but, Baghari was the one that just punched me in the gut.